Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the launch of State of the Newsroom 2021. You will see a link to the latest edition in the chat box if you would like to download it while this webinar is happening. As you may know, State of the Newsroom tries to summarize and look back over the previous year to try and get a sense of where the media landscape is at. In this latest edition, we discussed data journalism and the use of data in newsrooms and analyzed SANEF media releases from the past 5 years to see what exactly prevents journalists from reporting freely when they go out on assignment. The answer is the public, more than the police or political parties and groups. What this says about the public's understanding of the role of the media or public attitudes to the media is an open question. The focus of the issue, however, is primarily on local news, both print and online, tentatively on community radio. It's a discussion we hope to expand in the next issue of State of the Newsroom, and on what we call independent news outlets, which are mostly but not always donor-funded, the likes of amaBhungane, Bhekisisa, and new startups like the Outlier or the Conversation. We also pose the question, has our attention on the commercial media been overstated? If we want to truly invigorate the South African media landscape, and putting aside the public broadcaster for a moment, should we not be putting our efforts and resources somewhere else, in local print and online media, community radio, and in independent media? Of course, it's not to say that the commercial media isn't important. We're not saying that, but maybe it's not as important as we usually assume. To discuss this proposition, or maybe a provocation, we have 4 guests with us. Nadia Babulia, Executive Director of the National Association of Broadcasters, Mia Malan, Editor-in-Chief at Bhekisisa, Kate Skinner, Director of the Association of Independent Publishers, and Adam Oxford, freelance journalist, consultant and trainer and expert in data journalism. Kate, if I may start with you. During the pandemic, there were a lot of local print titles that were shut down or amalgamated with others. As you pointed out, these were local titles published by the big commercial companies, Caxton and Media24. Nevertheless, there was a general sense of local print media being in real trouble. In this issue of State of the Newsroom, you discuss a substantial loss in readership, some 8 million readers, and lower print runs. But overall, your survey of AIP members suggests a much more optimistic scenario in terms of local print news.
Yes. So I think what is interesting is it's kind of a mixed picture. So what we looked at as AIP is we looked at our database, and we did a big kind of revamp and a kind of, a lot of discussions with our members to just, find out what had happened and where they were at kind of, post the whole pandemic. And what we discovered was that there were a number of new publications that had joined. So that was exciting. We also discovered that, although a lot of publications had closed in terms of stop printing during the pandemic, they started to print again. So that was good, because there was a sense of like, we haven't lost them entirely. Just as you're saying, the big issue there was that they were printing less, and they were printing less regularly, but they were still there, and that was very useful. I think also what is interesting is that there are a number more online publications that are coming into the whole environment, online only. So that itself is interesting. And also, what we found was that a number of our publishers, are mainly print, but they've now started to become multi-platform. So they've, putting a lot more information out on social media. They are starting to develop their websites. I mean, some of them have had websites for a while, but haven't really updated them all that often. So there's movement. But I think what is also important to say is that the environment is still really tough. And I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later. I mean, the advertising, the economic environment, and the possibilities of getting funding into the publications remain really, really difficult. Yeah.
I mean, I've got 2 questions there. The environment is tough. I mean, what are some of the key challenges that local media face?
So I think one of the biggest is just advertising. I mean, getting advertising into publications. So if you're looking at a lot of these like small towns, rural areas, township areas, I mean, the economies are really depressed. And so literally just getting advertising funds in is a big issue. Also, one of the big issues is getting money from, advertising money from government. It is such a tough one. I mean, we've had a lot of discussions with GCIS, which is Government Communication Information System, and they're supposed to be getting 30% advertising of their advertising is supposed to be going into community media broadly. So that's radio as well as TV and print and online. That money doesn't seem to be coming to us. And in fact, some of our publishers that were, getting some funding from government are getting less, scarily less, 50% less. I mean, there's some issues in terms of KZN where so much less money is going into publications. So I think those are some of the things that make it really tricky. Print costs. I mean, we've got a lot of publishers that print. Those print costs have actually risen quite dramatically, 30%. In some instances. So I think those are some of the things that people are contending with.
I was struck though about your survey, which was quite interesting. Something like 36% of the publishers employ 3 to 4 journalists. I mean, this strikes me as quite substantial for local level accountability.
Yeah, so I think that the interesting thing about those statistics are that it was quite a small number of publishers that actually got back to us in terms of the number of journalists that they had. So I think it might be a bit of a distortion on it, but I think that there's a core of our publishers that, you're right, actually have a number of journalists that they employ. This is what's so interesting about doing this work, the statistical work in the sector, is it's so difficult to actually gather those stats. And so I have to say that it's a work in progress. You're right, in terms of the publishers that did respond, there was a sense of quite a number of journalists being employed. But also, we just need to understand that those journalists are generally freelancers. So they might at a given time be more freelancers and at other times less. So it's always kind of moving and shifting.
Just on the website story, I mean, the local print, they're struggling to go online, was what I understood too from your article, and to generate revenue online. I mean, can you say a bit more about that? What are their challenges?
And I'm glad you're asking me that question. So there is a real commitment from our members to basically go online and to have a website and to put out their information on YouTube and social media, etc. But what is interesting is that if you look at making money online, it is incredibly difficult. And it's incredibly difficult for small publications to make money, because the whole purpose of a small publication is to basically deal with the audience that's right there. And that's not necessarily going to be a big audience. And the fact that you don't have a big audience doesn't mean you're not doing your job. In fact, you generally are doing your job, because you're making sure that those people around you getting the news and the information that they need. But the problem with online is that you need to have huge numbers in order to make any kind of revenue. And so this is the sticking point that we have. How do we ensure that we make money online, but we're still doing quality journalism, and we are serving our audiences? And so that is the issue that we're grappling with. And at the moment, what we're looking at is saying, well, you actually do need to be multi-platform. There's still, most of the money comes in terms of the print edition. And so we're saying, be on social media, have a website, but still have your print edition. Maybe also look at other funding streams, such as, for instance, now events, cross-subsidized from other businesses. I mean, it's tough out there. You have to look at multiple streams of funding coming in order to survive.
Thanks, Kate. Nadia, if I can pick up with you at this point. I mean, you heard Kate's comment about the government funding for local publications. In your commentary on community radio, you talk about an undervaluing of community radio. What exactly do you mean by that? I mean, I assume there's a commonly held assumption that community radio is critical to the health of the media environment in this country.
Absolutely, it is vital to our democracy and our principles of freedom of expression, etc. But I think to the point that Kate's just raised around this 30% set aside, these were statements made some time back, absolutely never implemented. And that's the undervaluing I'm talking about, is the lack of real follow through and commitment. We can all make these political statements. And as you know, Alan, in our environment, which is a very heavily regulated environment, there have been more than 10 different ministers in as many years. So there's a lack of absolute commitment on that front. There are all sorts of promises made, never kept. I think the other thing, of course, is what we are very aware of is the minute you're hitting kind of local government elections or the national elections, everybody turns to the community media sector. Print, online, radio, etc. That's suddenly when there's the aha moment. We need to get into communities, and this has been really unsustainable. So I think it's across the board, particularly difficult for licensed community broadcasters. Very onerous obligations, be it the kind of monitoring to ICASA, etc. But really, their inability, to the points already raised, to raise advertising revenue. We're a deeply, deeply unequal society. The economy is totally gone. Rebuilding now as we emerge out of COVID is difficult. It's harsh. You just have to think about some of the broadcasters that had to shut because of extremely unaffordable signal distribution fees, which remains the largest input cost. Kate's talking about print actual publications, etc. So in the licensed radio environment, it's about signal distribution costs. Again, there, government made commitments to do some kind of subsidization. To date, I've not seen the kind of transparent reporting in terms of who got those subsidies, how was it rolled out, particularly in rural areas. So these are issues that are perennial, and they've been the last almost 30 years of independent broadcasting. We deal with the same issues.
In the sense I get from your piece, and to some extent from Kate's too, I mean, I know that Kate's doing a lot of important work to reinvigorate AIP in order to support local print publishers. But she also talks about cooperatives that don't get going at the national level because of infighting and so on. I mean, for community radio at least, and perhaps it applies to local print, do we have a situation where there's a whole lot of structures that just aren't working for local media at the moment, whether regulation, whether the new audiovisual law that hasn't gone through, the MDDA seems very dysfunctional in some ways, and structures like cooperatives and so on. Is that your sense, that things are either behind or need to be updated?
Look, I think we have to recognize and celebrate the gains made. More than 231 community radio stations, broadcasting this country. I think that this issue around governance and controls within a community broadcasting service has always been a challenge. You can imagine during COVID, annual general meetings couldn't happen, and that's a requirement in terms of ICASA reporting. Thankfully, there were some concessions made. I think that, those kinds of, it's communities, we're alive with complexity. So there will always be those issues and challenges. I think over the years, it's been strengthened. I think organizations like the MDDA, like yourselves at universities, other institutions have worked really hard in that area in terms of strengthening capacity for community broadcasters. I do think, though, Alan, that the real challenge is, are having to revisit the core values again of what these stations represent, who they represent, etc. We have seen and we've observed, unfortunately, a lot of influence that happens, and that's part of the cause, I guess, is how do we maintain kind of media that is driven through these communities? Again, in the regulated environment, these broadcasters have to submit their programming logs to this day, monthly programming logs. Just that act alone, just think about a community radio station having to pull all this admin stuff together. So on the one hand, it seems almost over-regulated, highly compliance-driven, very draconian, some would say. There has to be simpler mechanisms and simpler ways. However, we also know that much as people are looking at multimedia platforms, and Kate has raised this as well, community broadcasters have been looking at opportunities to improve, their footprint. So podcasting is becoming quite popular now across the board. But I do think structurally, these inherent issues we still have to deal with, but we do have to find simpler ways. We have to start thinking about, opening up the space to become more easier for lack of a better word, for community broadcasters to comply. I think we have to recognize just the incredible value that these services provide in society.
And just a quick follow-up to your point around sort of how they're situated in communities. I was struck last year, in fact, with the 5 community radios stations that were looted during the riots and looting after Jacob Zuma's arrest. I can imagine a different scenario where communities protected the community radio stations because they were so important to them and they thought their voice represented their interests. I mean, what was your take on that? Was it just random looting, or does it signal something?
I think it's a bit of both. Hey, I mean, I think during that period, the darkest time in our history, in our democracy as well, there was looting, there were opportunistic crime, etc. I do think you're right in that community stations that are embedded in these communities who have long history, there is that sense of absolute support, appreciation, and protection, if you will. I think that we are dealing with, as I said, great divides on the ground, and we have to recognize that. I want to say that what happened there, in terms of kind of the response by the other tiers of broadcasters, public, commercial, was amazing. People came forward, they said, how can we help? What can we do? So I think there's a real sense within this bigger scheme of broadcasting, a sense of real camaraderie, a sense of how we need to sustain this entire broadcasting ecosystem, and we need to do what we can to assist each other. That was an awful, awful scenario, and let's hope we never repeat that. However, we also know from time to time there's vandalism that's going on. Right now, the biggest crisis for all of us sitting right here in this room is uninterrupted power supply. Broadcasters, there's intermittent power issues, and now everyone's concerned with whether they have backups. The other thing that we learned very quickly is, are these studios insured? What are the policies and procedures around that? What are the kind of backup systems in place? So big, hard lessons learned, but you're right. I think it is about community participation. Remember, again, highly regulated. You've got to prove to the regulator that your community is involved, even in developing different program content streams. You've got to work across sectors in the community. And so there would be a buy-in. There would be the commitment from whether it's the women's group or the youth group or the local health services. And during COVID especially, hey, we looked to the media to get our information, to be reassured, to have a sense of community. It was these stations who were also drop-off points for food hampers, for example. So I think there was a real appreciation and understanding of the incredible role that community media plays. But that, unfortunately, let's hope we never have a repeat of that.
Thanks, Nadia. I see we have a comment by Peter Klutter who talks about big brands using the community stations for advertising because of their reach, which seems like a good point. Mia, if I can turn to you now, in the state of the newsroom, we survey several of what we call independent news medias, news outlets. amaBhungane, Bhekisisa itself, your publication, GroundUp, and newer startups such as the Outlier. Some of these are producing some of the most important news, as we know, and most, but not all, receive some kind of donor funding. How do you see the role of Bhekisisa in the media mix in South Africa at the moment?
Thank you very much, Alan. So I think, the main role of organizations such as Bhekisisa, donor-funded organizations, or if you manage to get your income in a different way, is generally specialist reporting. If you look at who is donor-funded, you'll mostly see health and social justice. I think we will see an increase in, for instance, environmental justice funding and mental health perhaps in the coming years. But ultimately, it is to do specialist reporting. And the reason why specialist reporting gets funded is because it generally relates to a larger issue that a donor wants to change. So in the case of health, you will see health journalism organizations, for instance, like Bhekisisa, being funded by large organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who ultimately want to impact on health policy, and they see media as a part of that. Now, if you look in South Africa, say, what is the role of Bhekisisa? So health reporting, if you want to do it in a really good way, in an in-depth way, it is a very, very expensive thing to do. And if you want to do it in an evidence-based way. And that by that, I mean, if you want reporters to understand research methodology and go through studies and include that in their stories, that's a time-consuming thing. And if you want to do a story properly, you would have to travel, and that's also expensive. So how we see our role as Bhekisisa is to provide specialist content that would generally not be affordable to commercial organizations at the moment because it's so expensive, and to provide that for free so that there is more nuance in their coverage, but they can have access to the kind of coverage that the media is really struggling to afford at the moment. But I think it's important to note that it's not that commercial large media organizations have become irrelevant, because without them, organizations like Bhekisisa would have a considerably smaller reach, because yes, we publish our stories on our website, but in addition to that, we distribute it to large publications in South Africa. And that's where our real reach lies. So it's very much a partnership kind of thing.
You mentioned in correspondence around, that an important issue for you is how the news making, let's say, if we call you a newsmaker, environment is different to commercial media. I mean, can you elaborate a bit on that? I mean, what are your daily routines like, the processes like?
So I think, I feel I can write a book about how different the lives of journalists who work for small media startups, and specifically donor-funded startups, is compared to large commercial newsrooms. Bhekisisa started off at the Mail and Guardian about 10 years ago, and I was always so conscious of the difference in job descriptions of Bhekisisa staff and the larger newsroom. Now, to give you an idea of how that differs, first of all, just because you are a small organization and you don't have access to, the resources that a large commercial organization will have. For instance, at a commercial newsroom, you would have a separate advertising department, and the editor-in-chief wouldn't be expected to raise funds. They're completely separate from that. They manage the newsroom and they look at content. In the case of a media startup, the editor-in-chief is the fundraiser, unless you have so much funding that you can have a CEO and the editor-in-chief and a fundraiser and that sort of thing. So if I just look at my job, I do a bit of everything. I edit, it's not that I just editorially direct. I edit stories myself. I fundraise. I help with branding. I go and, visibility is important for a small organization. So I have to speak at events like this. And each time you do it, it takes time away from the editing. And that is really why you exist, because you have the stories. But if I look at reporters, our reporters, when they write a story, they may get longer than in a commercial newsroom, about 2 weeks to work on a story. But of those 2 weeks, I would think easily a third of their time is spent on entirely different things, like helping to organize events. So we do public discussion forums. And when you do that, it's not just organizing the event, it's branding it. So someone in the office needs to create social media cards for that. Someone needs to think up the social media. Someone needs to live tweet from the event. That's all reporters who ordinarily do stories that now have to do those things. In addition to it, when they do a story, they can't just do the story. In addition to the story, they have to do 6 different tweets so that we can continue to promote the story. They come up with the tweets. They have to do 3 Facebook posts that they have to give the social media person to post, to an Instagram post, a LinkedIn post. They have to write an intro for a newsletter. I don't think reporters in mainstream newsrooms have to do that type of thing. In addition to that, because we have to be innovative as a media startup, and because we have the luxury of a bit more time to work on a story and time for innovation, we don't just do print stories. We also have now started with a television program. So that means that our multimedia team now can't just produce multimedia videos, which is entirely different. It's not the same as TV. They now also have to be involved in filming a TV program in a studio. They had to learn new skills to do that. They have to be involved in the editing of it and the packaging of it. So the kind of things that, and your job changes all the time because you want to continue to survive. life. And that often means that, almost always means, you need to look for additional funding. And it means that if you get a donor on board, their interests may very well be more in broadcast than, say, print stories, which means that you'll expand, but you won't necessarily have enough funding to appoint an entirely new team to do that part that you got funding for. So it's a very unpredictable environment, and something where when we appoint journalists, we have that thing in the job description that says, and here are your duties and whatever may come up, because that whatever may come up, I think, is a much bigger deal in a media startup than in a commercial mainstream newsroom.
When part of that unpredictability is, of course, ongoing donor funding, you might have seen that Julia Thornton in her commentary raises an interesting point, I think, where she says this: we shouldn't look at only at the diversity of funding in a single organization. I mean, we saw what happened to New Frame when diversity of funding sources wasn't taken properly into consideration. But you need to look at how funders operate across the media, a single media environment like South Africa. So, for example, the Open Society Foundation that funds about 5 different organizations in different ways, including Bhekisisa. And as I understand it, there are changes at OSF at the moment, going on at the moment. And, the vulnerability is that these changes trickle down to 5 different organizations at the same time. What is your understanding of this, or thoughts on this?
That's a very good point that you raised and that Julia raised in the report, Alan. So, one of the challenges with funding is that there are only so many donors that you can contact who are interested in media. So it's almost unavoidable that there are several organizations who are funded by, say, OSF in South Africa, because it's one of the main sort of like donors for media. But the other thing to look at in South Africa is we get most of our funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. There's another health organization attached to Section 27 Spotlight. They do wonderful work, and they also get their funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So there are 2 organizations funded by the same donor who ultimately aim to reach the same audience, because most donors want to make sure that there are evidence-based policies in place. So they look for media organizations who try to reach those audiences. So in South Africa, if you look at social justice that's covered by media startups, we definitely have a skewed sort of coverage of social justice issues compared to, say, 10 years ago when we had fewer donor-funded organizations. But I don't think it's a bad skewing, because 10 years ago, when we didn't have these organizations, social justice issues are not necessarily commercially very valuable. So they don't always they very rarely go onto the front pages of newspapers when they're covered in the way that media startups cover them. So because there's now so many opportunities for the media to be funded because our economic model collapsed, we see more of these issues. If you look at who funds which organization, you can go and trace every single organization in South Africa, a media startup, and you will see that the people who fund, or the organizations who fund those organizations, are very closely related to the founder of that organization. Now, when I say closely related, I don't mean personal relationships or friends. I mean the background where they come from. So if you're going to look at an organization who's headed up by a former activist, you will see activists like donors who fund that organization. If you see, for instance, Bhekisisa, my contacts lie more in the journalism and health world. So you see the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So I think the larger issue is not just with donor funding. The issue is that around the world, you'll see, if there's a media startup, and not just in the media world, in the NGO world in general, that the organization's sustainability is very closely linked to the skills of that founder. And that entire organization is almost built around the specific skills of that founder. And what we see is, after, say, 5 to 10 years, when that founder wants to move on, we very often see organizations collapse or becoming much less relevant, because the founder has strong donor relations that are now just like lost. The founder has specific skills for a specific type of journalism that they perhaps want to promote. And I think the larger thing of donor-funded organizations is that we need to see, how do you do succession plans? We need to see, how do you transfer an organization from the founder to a next editor in a successful way. And if you look at those organizations that you mentioned in your report, they all still headed up by the people who founded them. The only one that has had a slight, Health-E has had a change, and amaB has had a slight change because one of the people, Stefan Brummer, has moved on, but Sam Sol is still there. And the interesting thing would be when all of us eventually move on, whether these organizations will continue to exist in the same relevant way, even if they change a little bit, whether they will still be sustainable.
It's a very interesting point, and in fact, the Daily Vox is an example of what happens when the founders move on, which is narrated in the report. Thanks, Mia. Adam, I want to get back to the substance of your article that you write for this issue on data journalism and data in general. But first, a question. A colleague of yours, Gabby Rosano, talks about building what she calls local data narratives. This is in a context where there's a general sense that we lack reliable data coming from the state, coming from various other sectors for decision-making, for policy-making, and especially when you get away from the big cities at the local level. I mean, in your view, what part do you think local media can play in developing these local data narratives? Adam? We lost Adam. Oh dear, we've lost Adam. We'll just give him some time to see if he'll come back in a moment. He was on the road, effectively. We have a couple of comments and statements in the box, a couple from Marinette Jordan, who talks about the difficulty in getting a proper picture, really, of what's going on in the media landscape. I mean, I think we are getting there. I mean, I think someone, Kate's survey, for example, is a good one. There's been recent surveys on community radio and so on. But I suppose Marinette means it more generally, and that there's a lot going on. Kate, given that you've worked on a sort of a database recently, or can you comment on that? Would something like this be helpful, even possible?
So I mean, I think that it was a very useful exercise for us to go back to all our members and ask them all of these questions. And I feel that we made a huge amount of progress. I mean, from fairly low base, because I think our database, over a number of years hadn't been updated. So even before the COVID sort of period. So my sense is that what we need to do is we need to constantly update these databases, because I think the thing is that things are constantly shifting. I think the role of the State of the Newsroom is really powerful in terms of putting the stats together year after year. And I think, one of the things that we need to be doing is constantly comparing, what do we have last year? What's shifting? What's better? What's worse? And so the role, I think, of State of the Newsroom is very important. I mean, in terms of our own sector, I think what's interesting is that we do organize a lot of the people that are in the sector, but then of course there are people that are outside. And so I think that maybe what we need to be thinking about is, how do we make sure that we actually look at some of those people outside that aren't members, and ways to kind of capture those stats, I think are interesting, and things we need to look at for next year. Yeah, those would be my initial comments.
I mean, and these databases are notoriously difficult to keep updated, as you know. So, I mean, maybe all we can have is a snapshot as we move along, a detailed snapshot. Mentoring. There's a comment around using independent media for mentoring. Certainly, there was the survey by Kiri Rupia, who worked for the Continent. It talks about the value these places place for upskilling of young journalists. Nadia, if I can throw that at you, I mean, to what extent are community radio a space for mentoring for young journalists? Do they function like that still, or is it a mixed bag of whether there are opportunities for capacity building or not?
I mean, the interesting thing, of course, is, you know, and this is, you know, we're talking a very regulated environment, which is very different to the conversation we're having, which is a broader conversation on journalism as well, is that obviously every broadcaster is required by license condition to provide news and current affairs. And in the community environment of that, no less than 50% has to be from the community. So hyperlocal, local news, etc. And I think there's definitely been huge concern around, you know, the development of journalists in communities. So the work that the AIP, that SANEP, that others are doing, yourselves as well, in terms of training journalists, I think is still vital, is still, I think, a gap of sorts. Because we're talking about also citizen journalists, we're talking about user-generated content, we're also talking about an environment in which we are very concerned about misinformation, disinformation, and the unfortunate fake news, et cetera, that we all turning around issues of trust and credibility. And we're all turning around how we develop journalists with the kinds of skills required to be able to create good product at the end of the day as well. So I think there's a real room to grow that. I think mentorship, succession, et cetera, happens organically anyway. I think we must also be mindful of community settings where we're relying on volunteers a lot of the time. And when we do find great, excellent, you know, producers, creators, et cetera, they will get snapped up by the commercial sector or the public sector. So it's a constant flow, and this is just what the industry has been about for the last 30 years. I do think that there is great opportunity for stakeholders to work really in a decentralized way to be able to build that capacity. It is appalling also to hear, Alan, the kinds of salaries, if they even call them salaries, they're not even per diems, that are being paid to junior journalists. I love listening to Mia where she sketches out what the real challenges are and how you've got to be multi-skilled and how you're working not just in print publication, you're working across all platforms. And there's a lot more that needs to happen, to the point that Kate has raised as well. You know, getting the data, developing the data is hard work and it costs money. The NAB, we just do a state of the broadcasting industry report, and we've only done 2 of them in the last while. We can then canvass and survey our actual members, and that's how we, you know, get the data. Very different when you're dealing with a regulated licensees, you know who they are, you can find them. Here you're dealing with a wide range of publications and online publications as well, right? So I think the task becomes so much more complex, but I think we've got to commit and we've got to find the resources. Let's look at those donor agencies and look at how we can start doing this with greater regularity. Yeah.
It does sound like you need to be able to learn to embrace some measure of instability in the local media, and even, as Mia was saying, in independent media. Mia, you have a hand. You would like to comment on one of these issues?
Yes, I wanted to comment on the mentoring. So I do think that media startups provide a wonderful opportunity for mentoring. So at Bhekisisa, our aim is not to just develop health journalists for ourselves, but we want them to leave and move on so that they are health journalists who are upskilled and to draw from for other organizations. To give you an idea of the kind of mentoring that someone gets here is, you know, we spend an average of 35 hours per story of editing. It sounds outrageous, right? And crazy, but that includes the mentoring component. So we have a news editor where a reporter who will work with the reporter on the initial stages of the story and also do an edit. That's easily 15 hours of work. Then we have a content editor with a PhD in science, and all she does is she de-jargons the story and she checks facts. And, you know, the studies, when a reporter starts working here, is, you know, at least in 70% of the cases, it's interpreted incorrectly. So that person won't just correct it. She will sit with the reporter and explain why it's wrong. And then it comes to me and it's another 4 or 5 hours of editing. But the downside of it is that because we have to spend so much time on a story, we can't really accommodate university students because there's only so many hours in a week. So if someone wants to come and do an internship, we definitely don't want them to make photocopies or make coffee in the office, but for us to allow them to do stories is just logistically basically impossible. So there are fewer opportunities for students to come and do internship, but there's wonderful opportunities for working journalists to develop themselves. And we almost always take our journalists straight out of journalism school. We very, very rarely have appointed someone who has had experience. And the reason is because it's a different type of journalism that we do. So we would almost have to break down skills, and that would be frustrating for someone, and then rebuild it again. So yes, I see Marinette Jordan has asked the question. We do take in your students for jobs, but it's very hard for us to do it for internships.
While I have you here, Mia, or anyone, in fact, but Mia, perhaps I can start with you. Reg raises the sort of future scenario of, I mean, is there threats of do you have a sense of the threats of a government, a new government, actually starting to prevent donor funding coming in to fund new media? I mean, we've seen stuff like that happening in India, and there's some suggestions of that happening in places like Nigeria. So it's a possibility. I mean, I suppose the underlying idea is, to what extent does this increase the vulnerability for donor-funded news? Do you have a sense of that?
So you mentioned India now, and in India it has had a catastrophic impact. I can give you an example of when you're funded by the Gates Foundation for Media, they get the media organizations who they fund together, like about twice a year. And it's really a great opportunity to learn from each other and to look at how, you know, other organizations measure impact, that sort of thing. We wanted to gather in India this year, and it's been cancelled and transferred to another country because it was physically impossible to get into the country if you worked for a media organization, even if you didn't go to report there. And what you've seen in India with organizations who were previously funded by donors, donor-funded organizations, many of them have had to close down. So if that is going to happen in South Africa and it becomes impossible to get the funding in, then yes, you will see a lot, you'll see all donor-funded organizations close down, because it will, in India, for instance, it's not just that it's hard to get the funding in, it's also that if health NGOs even get funded, they get monitored so closely that what they can do is very, very limited with that funding. They can really only do what the government allows them to do. So yes, I think that would be a very, very hard thing to do. And something I just forgot to mention about, you know, what is different with if you work for a donor-funded organization compared to a commercial newsroom. Do you know how much time it takes to track impact of stories? Because donors want to know that you've used their money well and that your stories are read by people and have some sort of impact. That means in our newsroom, we have to track every single radio or television interview that someone does as a result of a story. We have to talk to the people that we interviewed within a month after a story to see if anything has changed. We have to keep track of every single email or every single retweet. In our case, we have to reach policymakers. So our donors want to know not how many Twitter followers do you have, they want to know who retweeted you. Are they policymakers? So those things, and then to write up the donor-funded reports, make a huge difference in how you spend your time in a donor-funded newsroom compared to a commercial newsroom. I would think a quarter of my time goes into tracking impact and writing donor reports or editing them. I have someone who writes them.
Thanks, Mia. Adam, do we have you? I see you come back and forth, so I'm not sure if you are just trying to log on or if your connectivity is just terrible. You disappeared again, so I'm presuming. I think he's still connecting. There was the issue of compensation, Kate. And then Nadia, if you could also respond to that. I mean, is something like regulation for compensation for young journalists and community radios worthwhile? But Kate, it does make me think. I mean, did you get a sense of how much journalists and local papers are paid? Is it something reasonable? Is it more voluntary? What is your sense of the situation?
Yeah, so my sense is that I mean, people don't get paid well. I mean, journalists basically, these are very, very kind of poor publications, survivalist publications. And so, people will get paid a certain amount of money. It won't be a large amount of money at all. But it does, of course, depend on the publication. And I think that's the other thing which is just interesting about our sector, is it is so varied and so diverse. So you would have, certain publications that would have more money and therefore would pay people more. I think, there are a lot of freelancers. And so the issue is around the fact that, people will be paid a certain amount because there's a particular, story that needs to be followed, and then not for a while, and then they'll come back in again and be paid for another story. So I think it's very up and down. I think regulating that would be incredibly difficult, just because if you started to go in there and say you have to pay a certain amount, that just might mean that certain publications would just not employ people because they literally there is no money. Or the interesting thing is, again, it's there'll be quite a bit of money at a particular point because a big advertiser has come in, or a certain amount of advertising has come in, and then there's less advertising at a different point. So I think that's what you've got to kind of understand if you're looking at print on online, is just that things shift continuously. Maybe let me leave it there.
I mean, it's Nadia, if I could get a comment from you. I mean, would regulating pay just be another bit of red tape that, as Kate suggests, will make it too difficult to work with? I mean, I suppose what we want to prevent is exploitation, right?
Absolutely, you want to prevent exploitation at every level, in every sector, in every part of society. I think trying to regulate or have kind of a minimum entry threshold just won't work. It hasn't worked across numerous industries. I think it's an ongoing challenge. I do think that the points that were raised earlier around donor funding and around, sustainability, ongoing viability of these industries is one that we all facing globally. I think the unfortunate reality in this country, I'm one of the people who believe there's sufficient resources. I think it's about how we need to turn things on its head. I think we need to start looking at why it is that we're not able to tap into corporate social investment money, why we're not looking at across the board private sector and government and different government departments investing more in community media. It's absolutely ridiculous to think that we live as human beings in an environment where everything is about communication. When COVID hit us, we saw these great divides and disparities, right? It was only those who were able to get online who could continue business as usual. The majority of society, and particularly our young people and children, couldn't do that. So these deep divides, deep inequalities in society that still have to be addressed, still have to be confronted, and they cut across, right? So what is it that the private sector, private industries need to do is to begin to address and to begin to review and kind of almost have a new conversation. And I think it's about how we have those conversations, how we create new partnerships, how we start to collaborate in different ways. Listen, brands want to push brands. We have to, it's very fine balance where we're having to accept that we're going to have a brand partnership on X, Y, and Z. At the end of the day, we want to get good, valuable information, education, entertainment out there that enables us as citizens to make the right decisions on whatever. And we need to start changing the conversation. And I think this unfortunate over-reliance we've had on donor funding, again, a global issue, but we have to, as South Africans and within our environment, begin to have those very, very intentional conversations across the board. So I think we really have to push forth. Also around journalism and training. Again, not my area of expertise, and it's wonderful to listen to Kate and Mia. There has to be some kind of concerted effort across the board and some kind of consolidation of what is happening in terms of training young journalists. Mentorship, internship, of course, that goes in every sector, in every industry. What we're concerned about here is exploitation on the one hand, but we're also concerned with the readiness, capability, ability, passion, and people who actually understand what journalism is about. I fear that sometimes we miss that as well.
I mean, as you were talking, and it's something I don't know because I haven't actually looked, but I mean, was there a sense that all this evidence of corruption that's emerging across the country, was there any concrete sense that this impacted on the community radio sector in any way? perhaps through funding through,
what we
what's
do
your
know,
sense
what
of
we
that?
do know is that that regrettable, awful scenario around digital vibes impacted on comms creation during COVID. So, I mean, I sat on numerous task teams, discussion forums, etc., including kind of government comms. How do we bring on board all tiers of the media to be able to develop good communications around COVID? We couldn't do them in all languages. We couldn't get every community station or every print publication on board. Funds were steered in another way. There's a classical example. This is exactly what happened. I think we also recognized at the time, everything shut down. I mean, print wasn't happening, right? People were turning to their radio. They were watching more television. The audience research, big upticks, etc. Government had to rely on the electronic media to support educational programs, etc., etc. But there's a fine example of the impact and the unfortunate reality of what happened. I know Kate and others that then there was some incredible work happening right at the president's office around raising additional funds and resources, and we've got to keep the energy on that. And I think we need to really start challenging decision makers now to begin to start implementing, not sprouting prose all the time.
I mean, this is a question, I guess, for anyone that's by Reg. He talks about a future scenario. So, I mean, if we had to sort of imagine 20 years from now, I mean, do we have a sense of what the South African media environment might look like? Is it something like a shrunken or consolidated or monopoly commercial media, as he suggests, with the state broadcaster very powerful, a few donor-funded organizations on the side? Has anyone sort of done some future projection of what things might look like? Anyone? Mia, Kate?
So let me jump in. I mean, I think that sounds like the kind of quite sort of a grim, scenario. So, I mean, what the hope would be from our side, so for instance, is that we manage to get a whole lot of funding coming into the community print and online sector. And we actually believe that very small amounts of money can make a massive difference. So the sense would be that what we would be hoping for is to kind of get our cooperatives to work more effectively, collectively, to get advertising in. So which would then hopefully mean that you would then have a real diversity of small publications, that basically service these small towns, rural areas, townships, etc. And the interesting thing, of course, is that there is a whole diversity of language that comes from that. So our aim would be to ensure that whatever we can do, whether it's government money or corporate money, we get that money into the sector, and then we get that sector growing. So the hope would be, I mean, I'm sure there will be consolidation in terms of the mainstream media, because it seems it's kind of moving in that direction. I'm not sure what's going to happen with the public broadcast. The public broadcast is absolutely critical. It's worrying that there doesn't seem to be a lot of funding going into the public broadcaster. But what I can say we are aiming at, whether we'll get there, who knows, but would be to try and ensure that we, sustainability is everything. We get that money into the community media sector, and then we do have that diversity at the local level. Thanks.
And Juliana's got a point about donor funding being unsustainable. I mean, my understanding, and also from her commentary piece, is that she says, she calls it retooling. I mean, she would probably explain better. But in other words, you look at multiple funding sources and multiple ways of generating revenue. And in fact, I mean, I think we are seeing the model where even the commercial media is drawing on funding for certain projects, certainly in other parts on the continent. Mia, the sort of mixed model, I mean, does that seem, what do you think of that, the sort of mixed income revenue model, commercial, donor funding at the same time? Or do you have a sense of that? So your mic's off, Mia.
Sorry about that. I think the best example probably of mixed funding in the country is the Daily Maverick, right? They get donor funding, they have membership models, and they get advertising. And I think for commercial media organizations, it's become very clear that you're going to have a mixed model of funding. But for smaller donor funded organizations, with regards to, is that sustainable? If you asked me 10 years ago when Bhekisisa started, is that sustainable? I would have said, of course it's not. And donors would have given you the same answer. They all wanted any organization who got funded by them. If you were a media organization, the first question they would ask you, so how do you become sustainable? You know, how can we wean you off of funding? They've changed significantly. Donors, first of all, started to give longer grants. You know, they've started to realize that a year grant is not something that's going to get anyone anywhere. So in our case, our grants are now 3 to 4 years of large donors that we've had, for instance, the Gates Foundation, an established relationship with. When I asked that same question now to the same donor, I actually did like a month ago, is donor funding sustainable? You know, because what is going to happen to us when you no longer give us money? And the answer was very, very different to what I got at the beginning of our funding. And they were like, we're in this for the long term. Now, I'm not saying that will exist forever and ever, but they definitely have a different view that you can't, that no media startup is going to be able to sustain themselves without that kind of funding. I do think, however, that, for instance, we during COVID have many different sources of funding. Now we largely dependent on one donor. That is not a good thing to do or position to be in. But you know what are the challenges is that, so there's pressure on us to diversify our funding, but that means I now need to, and I am busy doing that, but to build relations with new donors. When a new donor gives you a grant, it's almost always a project-related grant. And that means it's not money that they just give you to do whatever you're doing. They want you to do new things. So it adds more pressure to what you're doing, because that's how you start to build a relationship with them. And it's generally not a lot of money that they give you. In addition to that, one of the situations I often face at the moment when I go to donors is they say, well, you know, you're clearly very well resourced. Why do you need us? And for me to go and make a argument, well, obviously, because I need to diversify my funding is not a very good one. They're like, you've got the money, why would you need us? But it's not a good position to be in. So there's lots of challenges when you talk about sustainability and diversifying funding. There are a lot of challenges that come with that. And once you have all these new small grants, if you have 10 new donors, you're going to write 10 quarterly reports, you know, every quarter, and you need more administrative staff to do those things. So there are some challenges that you get with donor funding and reporting back that you wouldn't get in a commercial organization. And I think the way that I always see it, it's the other way around. In a commercial organization, you'll get the advertising, and then you write the stories, and then you get the advertising along the way. With donor funding, you tell them what you're going to do before the time, and then you have to do that and report back on it, and that adds something to your time, because you can't just take the money and not tell them you've done what you said you would do.
We have a question from France, Mia, while you're there. How common is the prominence of specialist donor-funded journalism groups that we see in South Africa and other parts of the world? I mean, well, you can answer the question.
Sorry, I didn't quite get that question. My internet cut out. Should I check? Yeah. How common is the prominence of specialist donor funded? I think it's pretty prominent, Franz. I obviously deal with these people because we often, you know, speak in the same webinars, or in the Gates Foundation's case, we meet twice a year. And if I just look at in the health world, you know, just one donor, and we know, you know, the Gates Foundation is a large donor, so obviously there are more organizations. They fund larger organizations like, say, the Gates Foundation, National Public Radio, Seattle Times in the United States, but also a lot of smaller startups like Bhekisisa, and they, for instance, fund like a few startups in Africa, several in Latin America. So I have certainly seen an increase. I don't have science to prove it with, but just in my personal experience, I've found a lot more specialist media startups to interact with than I was able to do 10 years ago. And I think donors want to fund two things that you don't see them funding hard news or just like, give money to a large media organization. They want to uphold democracy. So that's why they fund investigative journalism organizations, and they have social issues that they're interested in. Many media donors are donors who are not primarily interested in the media. They're interested in other issues, whether that's environmental justice or health. And they just see the media as one component of what is needed to achieve their goal. Lots of the other funding, or the majority, may go directly into that issue, into health organizations that do health work on the ground and not communications work. So yes, I think I definitely have seen an increase in specialist organizations. Yeah.
Thanks, Mia. That does bring us up to the hour. I mean, there is a question around press cards, but I mean, I suggest the poster speaks to Sanef, or would possibly be the person to clarify that. I'm sorry Adam couldn't join us for the talk, but you can read his article on data journalism in the State of the Newsroom, and the link has just been reposted. Thanks to Stuart for the technical backup to this launch, my colleagues at the Wits Centre for Journalism, Tylen, James, Irwin, the Press Council, and Sanef, as well as the Charm Project and CEDA, whose funding made this issue possible. Special thanks for everyone for joining us, and especially to the panelists, Nadia, Kate, Mia, and Adam, who unfortunately had technical problems. So thank you, everyone, and we hope you enjoy the issue. So goodbye for now.